On this month's University of Arizona Futures in Digital Learning podcast, we bring you a conversation with Dr. Cynthia Pascal, Associate Vice President of e-learning at Northern Virginia Community College, to discuss creativity in online learning.
There's a lot of opportunities in between point A and point B to get that authentic learning across and that creativity across.
Join us as we discuss what it means to be creative, ways to inject creativity into your course design, and why sometimes it's important to fail. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Futures in Digital Learning podcast. I am Adam Davi, Instructional Design Manager at the University of Arizona. Welcome again. I'm here with my co-host, Brian Hale. Hey, Brian.
Hey, everybody.
And we're joined today by Cynthia Pascal, the Associate Vice President of e-learning at Northern Virginia Community College. Cynthia, welcome to the podcast. We're excited to have you.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And today we're going to talk about a really fun topic, creativity. Cynthia and I are on the steering committee for OLC Accelerate this fall. And during one of our meetings, we got on the topic of creativity, and I thought, we just have to expand this on the podcast and talk about it more because it's one of my passion areas. I know it's one of Brian's passion areas, and Cynthia came across as very passionate about it as well. So I think we're in for a fun conversation today regarding creativity and online learning and everything that goes into all of that. So first, I just want to open it up to you, Cynthia, and ask, what does creativity mean to you?
So, for me, and I don't know, everybody has their own different experience, but for me, it's as close as I can get to having a spiritual experience.
Okay.
Creativity opens me up in a way that it allows me to be my most authentic self and my the best version of myself, and creatively problem solve. And so for me, it's a spiritual experience, as close as I'm going to get to my higher power as maybe going to church or something like that.
Excellent. I like what you said about it's as close to being your true self, right? Like when you're creative, it's you get to just explore whatever you want to explore, right?
Exactly.
And that to me is fun, and what's why we need to encourage it more, right?
Absolutely. Well, and I think, being in higher ed, it is very tricky because a lot of higher education, at least historically, is a formula, right? And so this plus this equals enrollment, equals retention, equals whatever. But I really feel like that is a major limitation to higher education. And so bringing in creativity allows you to expand that formula and develop new and other solutions and problem-solving techniques that maybe you wouldn't have thought of, that gets you better experiences and better practices to kind of break the old systems and formulate better systems that work better for where you're at today versus the historical context of how we do things.
Yeah. I definitely, in one of our earlier episodes, we talked about the 5-paragraph essay and, is it really necessary? And, are there other ways to explore the learning that is taking place in that 5-paragraph essay? And like you said, that in and of itself is really formulaic, right? Introduction, body paragraph, body paragraph, body paragraph, conclusion, right? It's just, and within there, topic, sentence, all those things. And so, how can we explore that, and how can we allow students to tap into that learning in ways that open up their world in more exciting possibilities?
And I think there's a time and place for everything, right? There's 100% a time and place for the 5-paragraph format, or the formula like A plus B equals C. And so in a context, you have to teach students that. You have to teach them the cultural norms of when you go into a job place. This is what they expect from a resume. This is what they expect from a handshake. This is what they expect from an interview or your first day at the job. But after that, it doesn't have to be such a big formula. And so what could it look like to say, yes, you can do this, and you can also do all these other things. And by allowing students to explore those other things, I think that what you're really doing is allowing students to, again, be their authentic self, right? Reach their potential. When we talk about, Maslow's hierarchy needs, talking about enlightenment, but you also teach them to build better solutions, right? So again, talking about the historical context of stuff, building better solutions and building collaborative relationships, which is another fun part about creativity, is collaborating with, your faculty or other students to break things and make them better.
Right.
So my question is, we were talking about this formula. What is the formula for being creative? How do you teach somebody to be creative? Because there isn't creativity 101. I can't go sign up for that. Is that something that I needed to have been paying attention to during elementary school, during middle school, during high school? And again, even in those environments, they don't really teach you how to be creative. They want to see you do the math and prove that you can apply the formula. They want to see you, apply whatever it is they're teaching. In certain fields, we can't be creative. In the medical field, for example, a nurse has to live within this box, because if they try and think outside the box, that's when malpractice lawsuits happen. But at the same time, there are those rare occasions where you need to think outside the box in a medical field to come up with a solution for a tricky problem. So as much as I always say, get creative when you're designing your courses, what does that mean? Creativity is something different for everybody. And, I was talking with another instructional designer and she had mentioned that she basically uses the formula for her courses, and there's no time to be creative. Yeah, it is. It is. That's the world we live in. There's no time for anything. But getting back to my other question was, how do you teach how to be creative to somebody?
So that was a lot to unpack. And I'll be honest, I think what your friend shared, I'm going to push back on say that's a lie we tell ourselves, that there's no time to be creative. Because each one of us brings creativity into every space we come into, whether it be the clothes we wear or even like the car we drive or a signature, right? And just like when we're creating our signature, for example, I mean, it's a skill, right? So you practice it over and over and over and over until you get your signature. And I remember doing that with my best friend when I was a kid. We would just sit down and practice our cursive, bubble letters. But it really is a skill. And what we need to be teaching is the skill of discernment. When do you have to use the formula, right? Again, there's literal formulas. I love the example you used about like nursing. But then you have things where it's like, experiences where it's like you do have to think a little bit more creatively and outside of the box, because nurses do. They go down the list, they look at symptoms, doctors look at symptoms, and they say, this isn't fitting the box. This is outside of the scope of the norm, and they have to think creatively. And if they just limit themselves to a checklist, we will never have progress, right? And it's all about progress, not perfection. And I think doctors and nurses will say they're not perfect. And I think it's the same thing for how we need to teach, is to teach the skill of critical thinking, teach the skill of creativity. And there's a lot of ways to do it, because I think, and this is a soapbox that I'm always happy to get on, the skill of building in authentic assessments into curriculum, right? An authentic assessment allows students to demonstrate student learning outcomes, right? In a way that suits them best. Well, if it suits them best, chances are they're going to be able to be creative with the product that they give you in a form that works best for them. They're going to build on a skill that they already know they have, a strength that they already know they have, and be able to build on it. I think that's one easy way, even for the busiest of instructors, to kind of build it into what they do. But I think also it's not, going back to, what does it all mean? it's building it in a way where you give some boundaries. Like my significant other is a tattoo artist. And so he's a creative, and it's very hard to date him as another creative because he gets paid lots of money to do what he does. I get paid zero money to bring creativity to my job. But there's a formula to build a rose. You know, you have to do petals, you have to do leaves, maybe a stem, maybe some thorns. So there is a formula, but within that, there's millions of different ways to get to that solution. And so I think that's what we have to teach people is there is this construct of this is what others will observe, but there's a million different ways to do that. And through that, you're generating, again, that critical thinking, that demonstration of learning outcomes, and that way to people to shine on their strengths rather than their weaknesses. So many times we ask people to, you know, perform in their weaknesses. A five paragraph essay will never be a strength for me. I'm dyslexic.
Right.
Or my neurodivergent friends, you know, it's very challenging, but ask me to make a PowerPoint, ask me to make a speech, ask me to do something creative, and I'm going to shine and still show you that I know exactly what my counterparts need.
Right.
Not entirely sure if that answered that, but
yeah. Well, I think
that's the tangent we went on.
Yeah, and I think that's great that you know the points you brought up, because one, you know, I think there is a misconception amongst, you know, a great majority of people that creativity is just for people in the arts, right? Like, do you play music? Can you draw? Are you an actor? Like those people are creative. But I can't do any of those things, so I'm not creative. And that's just not true, because you know, we have to, you know, get students to unlearn, and even get faculty to unlearn that, you know, misconception that they're not creative if they're not in the arts, because creativity, like you said, comes from anywhere. And, you know, if you know, to touch on your last point, get students and get people to play on their strengths, you know, have this assignment that is open-ended. And if one student wants to write a paper about it, great. And if another student wants to make a video about it, great. And if another student wants to do a PowerPoint, great. Like, as long as they're hitting those learning outcomes and they're able to, you know, to build on the strengths that they have and feel confident. And I think that's the key point there, is that student choice, where they're gaining confidence in what they're doing, and you're giving the opportunity to kind of break free from some of those formulas. Like you said, there's some areas where we have to like stay in that lane, and then there's others where, you know, maybe there's 4 lanes, right? And we can choose which one we want to go to, and they're all going to the same place.
And I think it's a really important, you know, building off of what you're saying is also to build that environment, right? Not only to build that environment within the classroom, but within the institution that you work at. So often we bring our own biases to what things should be or shouldn't be. And we tend to put people in the box. I just recently taught an open source course called Open for Inclusive Excellence. And it was all about teaching inclusive design and inclusive pedagogy, and really embracing open educational resources. And the instructor who inspired me the most was a math instructor. And, you know, we've literally been talking about formulas those last couple of minutes. And he brought so many creative ideas to the table. And here I am, I put them in a box. Like, in my mind, math teachers are X, Y, Z. They use this side of the brain and only this side of the brain, and they couldn't possibly bring something creative to the table, because this is how I learned math.
Right.
So everybody has to learn math that way, and that simply was just untrue. So making a space where he felt like he had the flexibility to explore different approaches to, in this case, online pedagogy, and where he had the tools and the training to get more creative so that he could do that, was just as important as what he brought to the table for his students, because he was given permission to make math exciting and engaging and fun.
Yeah.
I know in a million years, my high school self would have never said math was fun, but he made it fun. And so that we created a space for that, and then reinforced it. So reinforcing it being like, and told others, And so we
Right.
can do that not only in the classroom as we collaborate with students, but with our peers. Did you know that this was even a possibility? And again, I sure did. I had
Right.
no clue that was even an option. And so by him breaking my schemas of what creativity was and my biases of what creativity was, I can then share with others and kind of, I'm going to say pollinate other people's ideas of what of creativity could be. And that's
Yeah.
kind of where we got on this topic of creativity in terms of OLC. It's like, what would it look like if you just push strangers to be their
Right.
more authentic self and be just a little bit more creative and push themselves to drop their pretenses of what things should or shouldn't be and just go for it.
Yeah.
So what on that line of thinking, when you're working with students or even other faculty, how do you recognize that someone is headed down the right lane of creativity and continue to inspire that particular creativity in them rather than just, I'm going to open this up. This is going to be a creative assignment for you all. You can submit however makes you feel comfortable. And then I'm done. I've inspired your creativity. Now I get to walk away and you all can do the heavy lifting. How do we recognize that they are being creative and the light bulb is slowly starting to glow brighter and brighter? And then how do we keep stoking that fire in them?
I loved everything you just said. Personally, I think it's, well, with any teaching position, it has to do with building relationships and creating a space for feedback, right? And feedback can look a lot of ways. It could be, and you have to know your student or your peer. You have to know how they respond. Some people just want an attaboy, right? And you can give them an attaboy and they'll continue growing. Some people you push and you see that shining in them or that fear or that glimmer. It can look a lot of different ways. You have to kind of be able to put yourself in tune with that person and kind of pull at that thread a little bit and say, what could it look like if you pushed a little bit harder, or a little bit harder, or a little bit harder? And that's where really critique comes in, not just feedback, but critique. And that's just as important as positive feedback and positive reinforcement, solid critiquing. And so I think you can do it both ways, knowing your audience to do that. I think pushing the boundaries is always really helpful. And I had two women in my life who have said things to me multiple times that have hurt my brain with what they said. In terms of, one would say, regularly says, can you tell this to me in a different way? And so what she's trying to do is forcing me to say in a narrative that she can hear the information is, but it also reformulates how I'm thinking, right? It's reconstructing a puzzle to make it work for the audience. And the other person always says, I'm going to push back on you on this one, and then gives me whatever she's pushing back. And both women have broken that brain part that says this is the end. And I think any good artist, whether it be, like a Van Gogh or a Picasso, or a modern artist, will say, like, their finished product isn't actually a finished product. They could still add one more piece or, one more little touch here or there. And I think that's what we have to do is help people understand that things are living, help people understand that feedback's okay, help people understand that creativity doesn't have limitations, and that it's okay to push. And here's why that's important. So I'm going to take this to the next point. And that's important because our employers, I talk to a lot of employers. Again, I'm an associate vice president, so I am often working with people outside of the school just as much as inside of the school. One of their biggest concerns is that our students are not willing to fail. So, we call it prototyping in our Fab Lab. Prototyping is just failing a bunch of times in creative ways until you get to a solution. Because they have never been taught to fail, are taught to think outside of the box, they don't take constructive criticism well, or in this case, a critique, which is what you see in the art world well. And so what they tell themselves is, I'm not good enough, I'm not doing this well, I should just quit. And they're seeing a lot of former students putting in their notice the first time they fail. And so if we can teach students through feedback and constructive criticism and critiques that it's okay to fail, failing's part of the process, finding creative solutions is part of the process, is just as important as the final outcome. Now, of course, that's an unpopular opinion. The final outcome, we talk about learning outcomes, unpopular opinion, but you can always push it. And that's how you, there's that book, Good to Great. That's how you take people from good to great. Chances are your A student's going to be an A student no matter what you put in front of them, because they're going to figure it out. But you can push them to be a great student, a great creative. Someone who wasn't successful, you can push them to be successful by just finding what it is in them that's holding them back and removing that barrier.
And I like what you said about the safe environment, right? Like and a lot of what you talk about with being afraid to fail is being afraid to take risks as well, because they don't want to fail, right? Yeah. And so they're always just playing it safe. Okay, what exactly do I need to do? Tell me that so I can do it, and everything will be okay. And sometimes it's like, well, I don't know exactly what you need to do. Like, I want you to figure it out, but they don't want to, or they're afraid to, they're scared. And so creating that environment to, where it's safe, where they can take risks. And this last fall, I taught a course for incoming freshmen, and one of the assignments was the poetry assignment, and they had to read different poems and then write a poem that kind of emulated the style of one of the poems that they had to read. It, tapped into their creativity a little bit, but also a little bit scary, because, poetry writing can be scary, but it gave them kind of a structure of like, okay, here, you can kind of emulate this structure if you want, pick one that speaks to you. And one kid came up to me and he said, I wrote this poem. It doesn't emulate any of the other poems. And it's like 20 pages and it's all about Star Wars. And I know you're a Star Wars fan. And I was like, but he was like, I don't know if I should submit that, like, because it doesn't meet the assignment. And I'm like, submit it, put it, like, get it in there, show it to me. Like, yeah, I don't care. Like, and write your reflection about why you chose to do this. Like, what inspired you to write this? Like, reflect on it. Like, think about where this came from inside of you. And he, like, I could see that apprehension that, like, he's like, oh, I'm not sure. And it was like, but he felt confident enough to be like, I know you're a Star Wars fan. Is this okay? And I'm like, yes. And that's, you build that relationship, you create that space where they can feel comfortable. And I think it's the same when you work with faculty too, right? Like, if you can create that relationship where they feel comfortable and they're like, you can push back on their ideas, they can push back on yours, and hopefully build something that, is more creative, but also, realize we have to fit it in that box of the LMS as well.
But, I think there's 2 points that you brought up here is, that creating that culture of care and creativity right out of the gate, that's as simple as putting in your syllabus, in this class, I want you to know that you are cared for, that you are human first, and this is what I mean by that, and that this is a creative space. So if you have an idea to approach a problem and it's within the parameters of this course, that's okay. I would love to hear it, so creating that right out of the gate, and then reinforcing it by not just the words, but the actions, right? So, making sure your rubrics are set up in a way that that emulates that, or your assignments are set up in a way that emulates that. But then also incentivizing risk, right? Incentivizing care and risk and innovation with your students and faculty. I recently was at a graduation. This was like maybe pre-pandemic, so it feels like recently, but it was actually 3 years ago. And they had everybody stand, because I'm at a community college, who's transferring, and then everybody stand who's going right into the workforce. And I had never heard this, everybody stand who's an entrepreneur and going to start their own business.
Wow.
And that's risk taking, right? Yeah. That's incentivizing risk taking. And we don't do that in higher ed. In 4-year institutions, we say you go into the workforce or you go get your master's or your
Right.
doctorate. In 2 years, you say you transfer or you get a job, but we don't incentivize that risk taking. So just constantly, no matter where you're at, incentivizing that innovation and that creative space. And it could be outside curricular stuff as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the classroom. It could be that instructor who says, okay, I know we're doing this, but also let's do this. And that's what I'm doing with one of my friends right now. We're doing an innovation incubator. And so like we did creativity in the classroom, but we're like, but we have to, do it within the confines of like, this is accreditation and this is what a credit hour is worth and this is how much it should cost. And we're like, or we could do it free and anyone who's interested in it, whether they're a business major or not, can do this entrepreneurial project. And so we did it. And now, we're partnering with our Fab Lab, which I've mentioned it before. It's kind of this STEM associated laboratory where you can just try out new ideas and they build the technology and things like that. So we're partnering with them to like build on using other people to build on our creativity. And so it's kind of a win-win situation where we're all taking risks. We're all reaping the rewards of learning. And it's created this communal space and collaborative space where we can all just really shine. And you know what we're getting out of it? Nothing. We're getting personal growth and development. And you want to know what that gives me? Job satisfaction.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes they take a lot. Most of the time, it's not about a grade, right? It's certainly not about a paycheck at a community college.
Right.
So what is it about? It's about building joy in your life, building passion in your life. And just like any other skill, you have to build that.
That's why Brian and I do this podcast. We just wanted something fun to have these conversations. Yeah. So it's you're right. Like, where's the joy? Where do you find like that excitement? And that, comes back to Brian, what you asked, like, how do you stoke those embers? Right. And students come into the class with so many different identities, right? And so many different interests that go beyond just whatever the course description of that one class is. And maybe they're not even interested in that. They just have to take it because it's a, requirement or a gen ed, or it was the only class that fit their schedule, right? And but somehow, somewhere, like there is something that is interesting to them that they can relate to what's going on in that class. And it's getting them to realize that and having those conversations and those collaborations and how do we build that in, and how do we get faculty to understand that, that you can build that in and to encourage that. And maybe it is just a simple statement in the syllabus, right?
So I want to build off of that a little bit. And for the faculty that ask, how do I build in creativity in my class? I've also gone down that path and given them the ideas. And then the question comes up, how do I fairly assess everybody's different level of creativity? I don't have time. How do I do this very quickly? How do I set up my rubric? And my kind of stock answer is your rubric has to be specifically vague. And what a contradiction in terms that is. You need to write an essay. Okay, well, how long is it? It's however long you need it to be to get your point across. And sometimes that's what your rubric needs to say to the students, not your essay needs to be X number of words on X number of pages. Your rubric needs to inspire the creativity. It needs to be just vague enough so that they go away thinking, okay, how can I write this essay? How long does it need to be? Am I going to be penalized if it's one page over, or odd things like that? But how do we apply equity to everybody's different levels of creativity?
Well, and I think that's where open pedagogy comes in, right? And really learning how to assess students in a way where meets them where they're at. And I'll be honest, there's not an immediate reward on that sometimes. Sometimes it's building foundational skills in students that they're going to use years later in life, and you don't get the reward of having that moment with them. And that's okay, but I think it's one of those things where it's meeting students where they're at, being vague, building things based on like more like a taxonomy of things than a, multiple choice question, that kind of thing. Students will demonstrate. Well, there's a lot of ways to demonstrate stuff.
Right.
Students will learn. There's a lot of ways to learn things. And so by doing it that way, and then you just simply say, was it done or was it not done? It doesn't have to be like 1 through 5. It can be 1 point yes or or 0 points for no, and be that simple. It's important to have those parameters for a variety of reasons, but it is easy to do, and you don't have to do it for every assignment. See, authentic assessment is just that. It authentically assesses learning moments, right? So there's multiple moments of learning that lead up to the assessment. So you build it in throughout the course, and then allow students to demonstrate it in a different way. So it doesn't have to be this huge, like, theatrical ta-da at the end. It doesn't have to be that way. Ta-da take a lot of time, and when it's the last week of school and your grades are due in 2 days, you don't want the big ta-da. That's not the time for the ta-da, But there's a lot of opportunities in between point A and point B to get that authentic learning across and that creativity across. And then there's, with that, teaching people, faculty in this case, to chunk their information in their class in a way that makes sense, right? So not chunking it where it all happens on Thanksgiving break is a great example, or where it happens on the last day of school, and so that's part of that pedagogical framework where you give people skills to help themselves, and then it all kind of falls into place. And again, I say the word skills intentionally. It's a skill. It takes practice. And each time you get better and better and better at it, and then you learn something new and have to start again, and you make little tweaks based on feedback. And then you also learn what not to do,
Right.
And I think that's just as important too, letting someone go completely rogue and you're like, wow, you really missed the mark on this.
Yeah.
I can't accept this. There's time for that as well.
Yeah, and I think, like, you don't have to be an expert on anything other than the content that you're teaching, right? So if a student wants to submit a video, you don't have to be an expert on making videos and assess the technique that they use to make the video, right? You're assessing them on the content that they are presenting in that video. That's where you come in as the faculty member, the instructor, to be able to recognize that. And if your rubric is specifically vague enough to have that, then you can assess that. And I actually I attended an Adobe webinar a few weeks ago that was literally titled, how do I assess this thing? And talking about this very subject. So, if you're interested, go to Adobe. They might have it posted somewhere. So
getting back, Brian, the equity part of it, how often are we disproportionately penalizing people for not being English as their first language, neurodivergent, things like that? I think that this is a bigger case for equity in that sense. You were talking about that video, Adam, and I'm like, oh my God, what a lovely way for someone to not have to worry about their grammar, or not have to worry about, is this phonetically written or they, them, their, or, all these things in terms of like, getting it right, but just demonstrating that they know what they're doing, they know what they're talking about, and they will be successful. Because the other part of that is, any job you apply to should have some form of training to help you succeed, right?
Right.
But what they can't train you for is things like creativity. That takes too much time. And so many people would rather just train people who are problem solvers, critical thinkers, solution focused, positive attitude, willing to take risks, than someone who can do exactly what they're asked of, because if it's not within the context of what they're trying to do, then their help is not helpful.
Right.
I don't know where I was going with that, but
It was very creative.
Thank you. I just was following my heart, guys.
I mean, and that's the thing, is like, when it comes to creativity, there's no like one right in the box answer for what we're doing, right? Because everybody is creative in their own way, and we're just trying to put them in positions to be successful, right? And that's one of my philosophies with what I do. In one of my master's programs, I watched this video. They showed us this video from a National Geographic photographer, and he was talking about photography mostly, but also like the lessons kind of expanded out to being creative and kind of being life lessons. And one of the things he said was put yourself in the place of most potential, and he was talking about it in terms of taking
That's so
pictures, right?
good.
Yeah. And he's like, okay, where can I position myself? Where can I have the camera angle to be in the place of most potential to get the best picture? But really, like that on its own doesn't just apply to photography. Like, how are
Sure.
we putting our students in the place of most potential so that they can take the best picture, so to
Right.
speak, right? And so that to me it's always stuck with me. And it's hard. We're retraining, kind of ourselves with what we're used to doing. And we've all been in a classroom, like we have our set ways, and sometimes we can be stubborn too, I'm sure, about like, no, we have to do this, and
Yeah.
but recognizing, oh well, maybe this doesn't work, maybe if I just
Yeah.
change it a little, you know um,
Absolutely. And they
and-
tilt it, right?
yeah.
You just
Hmm.
tilt it a little
Right.
bit and it
Right.
works better. And I think that's where we go back to looking at the student from a holistic
Hmm.
perspective,
Yeah.
right? It's not just about the assignment.
Right.
It's, you have to get, again, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have to get the foundations there. So if the
Hmm.
student's worried about food, worried about toilet
Right.
paper, worried about menstrual hygiene products, guess what? They're not going to get to your creativity in a
Right.
minute, no matter
Right.
how beautiful your rubric is, right?
Right.
Great rubric. Thanks for that. So creating that space where that like baseline is there, and then
Mhm.
building on that skill, teaching that reflection. As you were
Yeah.
talking just now, I was thinking about, putting yourself in the place of most potential. I think of it almost like how we prep for meditation. And meditation looks different for everybody,
Mhm.
but is your environment quiet? Are the sounds appeasing?
Yeah.
Are there distractions, or do I need a specific candle to focus on? Some people don't. But it's getting yourself in that headspace. And that's the
Mhm.
same thing for creativity or learning in general. It's like, what are the conditions that I'm creating for myself, and how am I reinforcing those conditions? So like
Yeah.
the reinforcing the conditions, the Artist's Way talks about this a lot. One of the first, the Artist's Way book, I think it's on its 30th anniversary year kind of thing, but it teaches the reader, whether they're a lawyer or an actual artist, to be more creative. And it
Mhm.
challenges you to go on dates with yourself. That's the first check. And do a date that inspires creativity, or buy something for yourself that inspires creativity. Maybe it's a fancy pen, maybe it's a sticker. What it's doing is it's shifting your mind, it's tilting your headspace to
Mhm.
allow that potential, that openness, that willingness to be creative. And once that key to willingness is in the door,
Mhm.
then you just crank it open a little bit. And again, it's just a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And eventually that door opens. For many of our students, it will never come as a flood. For some, it
Right.
might.
Yeah.
Your student, you said with the 20-page Star Wars, like they had a good day. I
Yeah.
don't know what they were doing that day. So they were
Right.
firing on all cylinders, and they're like, this is happening, and they took a rest.
Yeah.
Most people, it's just going to be little adjustments
Right.
and pushing themselves in these micro levels. And that's okay.
Mhm.
But eventually, just like meditation, where some people can sit down for 30 minutes or an hour, you can become more and more and more creative
Mhm.
because you've pushed open that door wider and wider and wider
Yeah.
to make space for that.
I love that you talk about the trickle, right? Like it doesn't all happen at once, right? It's little things. And there's a book I read called Zigzag, by Keith Sawyer, and he talks a little bit about that too, right? Where you're just like change one little thing, right? And then go back and change another thing. And he talks about it, kind of there's activities sprinkled throughout the book, and one of them is just kind of drawing, and you draw one line, and then you sit with it, you come back, you draw another line, and I feel like that's what it is, right? It's like you're just asking students, just draw one line right now. You don't have to draw the whole picture. Just draw one line, see how it feels, sit with it, come back to it, and then we'll keep building on that, right? So,
and I think that's the exact approach. Brian mentioned, his friend, his colleague who said, I don't have time for this. Nobody has time to redesign their entire framework and model of like teaching. One line, one assignment, one discussion, one rubric, like how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? You can do that in over a year, change your entire practice. And that's the other part is getting feedback, asking your students, hey, reflect. Part of this is assignment and is reflection. What would you like to see done again? What didn't you like? And it might be they like everything. And it might be that they're like, this took 10 hours. You said it was going to take 10 minutes. And it's like, lessons learned. But that's how you do it. Otherwise, you will get overwhelmed. And when we're overwhelmed, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. I'm a freezer, by the way.
Yeah.
And so you don't do anything. You're like, I can't possibly do this, and I'm going to do nothing.
Right.
And that's the antithesis of what we want here, right? We want little, small actions that help build this response that allows for creativity, allows space for creativity.
Yeah.
And some people will use the space wisely, and some people won't.
And I think that's the big key. And I think that's a good place to end, right? Is to how are you building space, in your online learning for creativity for students and for yourself? Like where's that space coming from? And it doesn't have to be a stadium size space, right? It can be, it can start small, right? It can be a closet size space.
Wait a minute. Once I become a teacher, you mean I have to keep learning?
I know.
The horror.
What is that?
Horror. As a global community have talked about mental wellness ever since the pandemic, and a lot of things we hear of, you can't pour from an empty cup. And the same thing goes with creativity. You cannot give what you don't have. and so allowing yourself that same space and grace you would want for creativity as well, to unbutton that top button a little bit, to give yourself the opportunity to relax your shoulders so you're not so tense, and then the willingness to try something a little bit different. And when you model that creativity, model that willingness, and model that wellness, because creativity is directly tied to wellness, mental health, well-being, which again, for me, goes back to that higher power, which is a really important thing. Then you're allowing that space for others to have wellness through creativity.
And that's a beautiful thing, right? And that's what we want. We want to inspire more creativity out into the world, because that's how we all grow, right? And that's how we all learn from one another. I think this was such a wonderful conversation, and I could talk for hours and hours and hours about it.
Me too.
So maybe we'll have to do a part 2 at some point in the future. Or I know, Cynthia, you and I have talked about hopping on to OLC Live, or the new reincarnation of OLC Live at Accelerate this fall, and continuing the conversation as well. So thank you again for joining us today, and we're so happy to have this conversation with you.
Thanks for having me, gentlemen. I appreciate y'all.
The Futures of Digital Learning podcast is a production of the University of Arizona University Center for Assessment, Teaching, and Technology. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas you'd like to share with our office, go to the Contact Us link on our website, ucatt.arizona.edu.